I always thought that if my marriage ever fell apart, it would be behind closed doors, something private, something controlled. I imagined maybe we'd sit across from each other at the kitchen table, voices low, tension thick, the kind of scene where two people slowly admit that love just isn't enough anymore. I never expected it to explode in front of my entire family in the middle of what was supposed to be a simple picnic, laid bare by a drunk stranger who knew more about my wife's secret life than I did. Looking back, I should have seen the cracks forming before they turned into an earthquake. My wife, Ashley, had always been the type to command attention. She knew how to work a room, how to make people feel important, how to weave stories that made her seem bigger than life. It was one of the things that drew me to her in the beginning, her charm, her confidence, the way she could light up a conversation and make you feel like the only person in the world. But over time, that light started shifting, dimming in my direction and shining elsewhere. I didn't notice at first. Maybe I didn't want to notice. Life had settled into its routine, work, bills, raising our daughter, planning for the future. I thought that was just how marriage worked, that sometimes people drifted a little and you had to find ways to pull each other back in. But now I realized that while I was trying to keep us connected, she had already untied herself from me entirely. The first signs were small, the kind of things that you don't think too much about until hindsight makes them blindingly obvious. She started dressing up more, even for the most mundane errands, spending extra time on her hair and makeup, wearing perfume to go grocery shopping. At first, I chalked it up to wanting to feel good about herself, and I encouraged it. Then there were the excuses, late nights at book club, sudden work functions that I apparently couldn't attend because it was just employees, weekends away with her friends that never made sense because she never talked about those friends outside of those trips. If I asked too many questions, she would roll her eyes and make me feel like I was being suffocating, like I was the overbearing husband who just couldn't let her breathe. And then there was her phone. That damn phone. It was always in her hand, but never in a way that felt normal. She would tilt the screen away when I walked by, swipe messages away the second they popped up. If I asked who she was talking to, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Why do you always need to know? It's just Megan. Always Megan. Her best friend. Her alibi. The one person she knew I wouldn't question." And for a long time I didn't. Because I trusted her. Because I loved her. Because the idea that my wife, the woman I had built a life with, had a daughter with, could be betraying me felt impossible. That's what made the picnic hurt the most. It wasn't just that she had been lying to me, it was that she had been so confident, so brazen, so convinced that she would never get caught that she never even considered that her perfect little secret could blow up in her face in front of everyone. She had hidden it so well, played the role of loving wife and mother so flawlessly that she never saw it coming. But the thing about secrets is that they don't stay buried forever. And when they surface, they do it in the ugliest ways imaginable. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering. A chance to unwind, to let our daughter run around with her cousins, to sit in the sun and feel, just for a little while, like everything was normal. I remember setting up the blanket, watching Ashley laugh with my sister, flipping burgers on the grill while my dad cracked one of his terrible jokes. It was one of those rare moments where life felt easy, where I wasn't worried about work or bills or whatever small tension had been lingering between me and Ashley lately. I let myself believe that things were fine. That maybe I had been overthinking things, letting paranoia seep in where it didn't belong. And then he showed up. A man I had never seen before, stumbling into our picnic, reeking of alcohol and sweat, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. He smirked, wobbled forward, and called out her name in a way that sent ice straight through my veins. "Ashley! Didn't expect to see you here, babe. Thought you were spending the weekend with me." Everything stopped. The conversations, the laughter, the movement, it was like the entire park had gone silent, waiting for the explosion that was about to happen. And at that moment, I knew. I didn't need to ask, didn't need to look at her face to confirm it. Because I felt it deep in my gut, in the way the air shifted around us. My wife had a secret. And it had just walked straight into the middle of our perfect family picnic. The moment that drunken stranger slurred my wife's name and stumbled toward our picnic, the world around me slowed down. I could hear the distant laughter of kids playing, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the soft hum of conversations happening around us, but everything felt muted, drowned out by the sudden pressure building in my chest, the weight of something so obvious, so unavoidable that I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. Ashley's entire body stiffened beside me, her fingers clenching so tightly around the plastic cup in her hand that I thought it might crack under the pressure. She didn't turn toward him right away, didn't react with shock or confusion like an innocent person would have. Instead, there was this moment, so brief that anyone else might have missed it, where she hesitated, her mind racing, calculating how to handle this, how to get out of it without losing control. That moment told me everything I needed to know. I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as she slowly turned toward the man, a tight, forced smile already forming on her lips. It was the kind of smile she used when she was irritated but trying to mask it, the same one she gave me whenever I asked too many questions about where she had been or why she was acting distant. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they weren't expecting but are still determined to manage. That was what shattered me the most in that moment, not just the betrayal, not just the fact that I now knew, without a doubt, that she had been lying to me, but the way she wasn't even afraid of being caught. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't ashamed. She was annoyed. The man, still swaying slightly, grinned like he had just cracked the funniest joke in the world, completely unaware of the bomb he had just dropped. He was tall, built in that effortlessly athletic way that suggested he spent more time at the gym than he did working an actual job, his dark hair messy, his shirt slightly unbuttoned like he was still recovering from the previous night's drinking. He wasn't some random drunk who had mistaken her for someone else. He knew her. The way he looked at her, the way his eyes flickered with recognition and something disturbingly close to possession, it made my stomach turn. I felt my sister shift beside me, her eyes darting between Ashley and the man, the tension in the air so thick it was impossible to ignore. My mother, who had been laughing just seconds earlier, had gone completely silent, her gaze locked on Ashley's frozen expression. My dad, usually oblivious to social cues, had stopped mid-bite into his burger, his face twisted in confusion. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. But I was the only one who already knew the answer. I should have confronted her right then and there, should have demanded an explanation, should have torn the truth out of her before she had the chance to weave another lie. But I didn't. Because I needed to see what she would do first. I needed to watch her, to hear whatever excuse she was about to throw together, to confirm just how deep this betrayal really went. So, I waited. I clenched my jaw, my fingers digging into my thighs, my entire body wired with tension as I watched her carefully construct her reaction. She exhaled sharply, forced a laugh, too loud, too forced, then turned toward the group with a shrug, already crafting her version of the story before anyone else had a chance to speak. She called him just some guy, claimed he was a weirdo from the gym who wouldn't leave her alone. Her voice was light, casual, dismissive, but there was something underneath it, something sharp, something angry. Not at him. At me. At us. At the fact that this was happening in public, in front of my family, in a way that she couldn't control. And that was when I realized the truth. She wasn't upset that she had been caught. She was upset that she hadn't been able to control how it happened. She wasn't scrambling to deny it because she was heartbroken or guilty or devastated about what this meant for our marriage. She was scrambling because her perfect little secret had just been shattered in the most humiliating way possible. Because she had spent months, maybe longer, carefully balancing her two lives, one with me, the loyal, oblivious husband, and the other with him, whoever he was. And now, thanks to his drunken stupidity, it was all crumbling around her. My hands clenched into fists, my pulse hammering in my ears, my vision tunneling as I stared at the woman I had once trusted with everything. I wanted to scream at her, to demand the truth, to rip away the carefully curated facade she had built and force her to admit to everyone exactly who she was. But I also knew her too well. I knew that whatever confrontation happened here, in front of my family, in front of our daughter, she would twist it, turn it around, make me look like the bad guy. And I refused to give her that satisfaction. So instead, I swallowed the fury burning in my chest, stood up and quietly excused myself from the picnic. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, their confusion, their uncertainty about what had just happened, but I couldn't focus on them. I needed air. I needed to be away from her, away from the mess she had made, away from the version of my life that had just been ripped apart in the span of seconds. I walked toward the parking lot, each step heavier than the last, my breath coming too fast, too shallow, my mind racing with images I didn't want to see, thoughts I didn't want to think. How long had this been going on? How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied straight to my face? Was this just a fling, or had she already decided that I was nothing more than a backup plan, a placeholder until she found the right moment to leave? I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, my grip on the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles ached. I wasn't ready to go home. I wasn't ready to face her, to hear whatever excuse she was preparing, to listen to her try and turn this into my fault. But I also knew that I couldn't avoid it forever. She had been exposed. The carefully controlled narrative she had built was starting to fall apart. And whether she was ready for it or not, whether I was ready for it or not, the confrontation was coming. And this time, there would be no way for her to lie her way out of it. The drive home was a blur, my mind running in circles, replaying every moment from the picnic, every second of that drunken stranger's words, every flicker of panic I had seen in Ashley's eyes before she had buried it beneath that fake laugh. That dismissive wave of her hand. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but it did nothing to steady the rage simmering inside me, the sickening mixture of betrayal and humiliation threatening to boil over. I had spent years believing in our marriage, in the life we had built together, and now, with just a few slurred words from some idiot at a public park, it had all come crashing down. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was the way she had looked at me when she realized she had been caught, not with fear, not with remorse, not with the weight of someone who knew they had just shattered their spouse's entire world. No, it had been something closer to irritation, frustration, like I was the problem, like I was just another obstacle getting in the way of her carefully balanced double life. I knew she would be home when I got there. She hadn't come after me when I left the picnic, hadn't even tried. That in itself told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't worried about me, wasn't concerned about what I had just learned. She was probably sitting at home right now, preparing her defense, crafting whatever story she was going to feed me to try to manipulate the situation back into something she could control. That was Ashley's way. She had never been the type to panic, never been the type to break down and beg for forgiveness. No, she was calculated, strategic, the kind of person who could look you straight in the eyes while feeding you a lie so well-constructed that you'd doubt your own sanity before you questioned her. But not this time. This time, there was no excuse good enough, no lie convincing enough to undo what I had heard with my own ears, what I had seen in her body language. In the way she had known exactly who that man was the second he had stumbled toward our family like some deranged messenger sent by the universe to rip away the last of my ignorance. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already parked in its usual spot, the house quiet and still, deceptively normal, as if my entire world hadn't just imploded hours earlier. I sat there for a moment, gripping the keys so tightly in my palm that they left indentations in my skin, trying to force myself to take a deep breath to calm the storm raging inside me. But how do you prepare for a conversation that you already know will change everything? How do you brace yourself to hear the truth, or worse, more lies, when you already know deep in your gut that the person you loved, the person you had committed your life to, had been looking you in the eyes for months, maybe years, while betraying you behind your back? There was no way to steady yourself for that. There was no way to walk through that door and come out the same person. When I finally stepped inside, she was there, sitting on the couch, legs crossed, phone in her hand, her expression carefully composed. She didn't look nervous, didn't look guilty. She looked ready. Like she had been waiting for this moment, like she had already rehearsed whatever version of reality she was about to try and sell me. The sheer audacity of it nearly sent me over the edge. How dare she sit there, calm and collected, after what had just happened? How dare she act like this was some minor inconvenience she now had to deal with, like I was just an overreacting husband who needed to be pacified before things got out of hand? I didn't ask her if it was true. I didn't need to. I just stood there, staring at her, waiting, daring her to say something first, to make the first move. And she did. She sighed, slow and exaggerated, like I was exhausting her before I had even spoken, then leaned back against the couch, crossing her arms as she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to let me know that she wasn't planning to apologize. She was planning to argue. And that was when I knew without a shadow of a doubt that there was nothing left to save. Because she wasn't sorry. Not even a little. She started with the usual tactics, deflection, minimization, playing the victim. She said the man at the park was crazy, that he was just some guy who had misread things, that I was being ridiculous for even entertaining the idea that there was something going on. When that didn't work, she shifted gears, accusing me of embarrassing her, of making a scene, of storming off and making the entire situation look worse than it actually was. That was how she worked. If she couldn't convince me of one lie, she would shift to another, trying to find the one that would stick, the one that would plant just enough doubt in my mind to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting. But she underestimated me. Maybe the old version of me, the one who had spent months ignoring the red flags, would have swallowed those excuses, let her twist my mind into knots until I started apologizing for her mistakes. But not anymore. Not after today. The moment I told her I had seen it in her face, that flicker of recognition, that split second where she knew she had been caught, something changed. The mask slipped just for a moment, and in its place I saw something else. Not regret. Not sadness. Not even fear. Just annoyance. Like I was ruining something for her, like I was derailing whatever version of events she had planned out in her head. And that was when I realized the full extent of it. Not only had she been cheating, not only had she been lying to me, but she did not care. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't devastated about hurting me, about breaking our marriage, about what this meant for our family. She was just angry that she had been found out in such a humiliating way. That realization hit harder than anything else. It was one thing to be betrayed, but it was another thing entirely to look into the eyes of the person you had built your life with and see nothing. No love, no remorse. Just irritation at the inconvenience of getting caught. And in that moment, standing there in our living room, staring at the woman I had once trusted more than anything, I felt something inside me snap. The pain was still there, but beneath it, something else was forming. Something stronger. I wasn't going to beg for an explanation. I wasn't going to scream or cry or give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. No, I was done. She was done. I didn't know exactly what my next move was, didn't know what the coming days, weeks, or months would bring, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I was never going to look at her the same way again. The woman sitting on that couch, spinning lies as easily as she breathed, wasn't my wife. She was a stranger. And I wanted nothing more to do with her. The moment I turned away from her, something inside me shifted, like the final thread of whatever had once held us together had been severed. I had walked into that confrontation expecting some kind of emotional explosion, expecting either a flood of desperate apologies or a fiery argument that would tear through the house, but instead, I had been met with nothing, no remorse, no sadness. Just indifference. And somehow that hurt worse than anything else. I had spent years loving this woman, trusting her, building a life with her, and yet, in the moment where everything came crashing down, she wasn't even trying to fix it. She wasn't reaching for me, wasn't grasping at excuses with any real desperation. She was just annoyed that she had been exposed. That was it. That was what our marriage had been reduced to, a mere inconvenience for her. And the weight of that realization hit me harder than I ever could have imagined. I walked out of the house that night, not because I had anywhere to go, but because I couldn't stand to breathe the same air as her anymore. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached, my mind racing through every memory, every moment that now felt like a lie. How long had it been going on? Had she ever really loved me? Had she looked me in the eyes before slipping into bed with him? Had she kissed me goodbye, knowing she would be with him later? The thoughts circled endlessly, poisoning everything I had once believed about my marriage. And no matter how many times I tried to tell myself that I deserved better, that she wasn't worth the pain, I couldn't shut it off. Because it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the waste. The waste of time, of love, of devotion. I had spent years pouring everything I had into this woman, into our home, our family, believing in a partnership that, as it turned out, had only ever existed in my own head. The worst part was knowing that she had never intended to confess. If that man hadn't drunkenly stumbled into our picnic and exposed her, she would have carried on lying to me indefinitely, would have continued smiling at me, telling me she loved me, pretending that she was still the woman I had married. She would have kept looking me in the eye every day, knowing she was betraying me, and she wouldn't have lost a second of sleep over it. And that was what made the pain unbearable, not just the betrayal itself, but the ease with which she had lived in her deception. She hadn't been slipping away from me, hadn't been struggling with guilt, hadn't been tormented by the weight of her actions. She had been fine. Happy even. As if breaking her vows, lying to my face, and making a fool of me in front of everyone who mattered most to me was just a minor detail in the grand scheme of her happiness. I ended up in a parking lot somewhere, staring blankly at the windshield, the streetlights above casting long shadows over the dashboard. I should have been raging, should have been planning my next move, should have been calling a lawyer or figuring out what to do with our house, but instead, I just sat there, numb, hollowed out in a way I had never felt before. I had always imagined betrayal to be fiery, chaotic, something that erupted in anger and screaming and broken glass. But the truth was, it was cold. It was quiet. It was a slow, sinking weight in my chest, a realization that settled deep in my bones that nothing would ever be the same again. That the person I had built my life with had been a lie. That the version of Ashley I had loved no longer existed, if she ever had at all. I thought about our daughter, about how she had been running through the grass at the picnic, laughing, completely unaware of what was unraveling just a few feet away. How was I supposed to tell her? How was I supposed to explain that her mother had chosen a different life, that the home we had built was about to split down the middle? The thought of it made me sick. No child should have to be caught in the crossfire of their parents' mess, but there was no way to protect her from this. No way to shield her from the reality that our family was no longer whole. And as much as I hated Ashley in that moment, as much as I wanted to walk away and never look back, I knew that I couldn't make this decision based on my pain alone. I had to think about what came next, not just for me, but for our daughter, for the life I still had to build, even if it was without the woman I had once thought I'd grow old with. Eventually, exhaustion settled over me, heavier than the anger, heavier than the grief. I was too drained to keep running, too empty to keep replaying the same thoughts. I turned the car around, drove home, and walked into the house knowing that the life I had walked out of earlier that night no longer existed. I didn't say a word to Ashley as I passed her sitting on the couch, still glued to her phone like none of this had happened, like she hadn't just blown up our entire marriage and was already moving on from the wreckage. I didn't have the energy to fight, not yet. Instead, I went to bed alone for the first time in years, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, the separation, the divorce, the untangling of our lives. But in that moment, I wasn't ready to face any of it. I just lay there, lost in the quiet destruction of what had once been my world, wondering how long it would take before the pain stopped feeling like it was going to swallow me whole. Waking up the next morning felt like stepping into a different life, one where the air in the house was thick with something unspoken, where the weight of betrayal pressed against every inch of space like a heavy fog. I hadn't slept much, if at all. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind dragged me back to the picnic, to that slurred voice calling out my wife's name, to the way she had stiffened before pasting on that fake smile, to the sheer, soul-crushing realization that my marriage had been over long before I had known it. And now, lying in bed alone, the sheets on her side untouched, her presence still lingering in the house like a ghost, I knew I had to decide what happened next. I couldn't keep floating in this limbo, couldn't pretend that anything about this could be fixed. There was no coming back from what she had done, no salvaging the wreckage. It was time to walk away. The thing about betrayal is that it forces you to see everything through a different lens. I had spent years thinking that love meant fighting for your partner, that it meant weathering the storms together, but now I saw the truth. Love isn't supposed to hurt like this. Love isn't supposed to be something you have to beg for, something that can be so easily discarded when something shinier, something newer, comes along. Love isn't supposed to be a lie, and that's what my marriage had been. A lie that I had been the last one to realize, the last one to accept, the last one to let go of. But I was done now. I refused to spend another day, another hour, another second pretending that Ashley was someone she wasn't, that she was still the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. That version of her didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. She was in the kitchen when I finally pulled myself out of bed, still in the same leggings and oversized sweatshirt she had thrown on after getting home the night before. She wasn't rushing to fix anything, wasn't tripping over apologies or scrambling for ways to make this better. No, she was sipping her coffee like it was any other morning, scrolling through her phone, acting like nothing had happened. That was what infuriated me the most, not just the betrayal itself, but the way she carried it like it was nothing, like she had already moved past it. Like she had been waiting for this moment for so long that it barely even registered as an inconvenience to her. She looked up when she heard me, her expression blank, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I didn't want to hear whatever excuse she had prepared, didn't want to listen to the carefully rehearsed words that would mean nothing. I told her we were done. I told her I wanted a divorce. And the moment the words left my mouth, I saw it, the flicker of something sharp in her eyes, something cold, something that told me she had already accepted this outcome long before I had. She didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't cry. She just sighed, shook her head slightly, and muttered something under her breath about how I was being dramatic. And that was it. That was all the fight she had in her. No confession, no remorse, no attempt to salvage what was left of us. She had already checked out. She had checked out long before I even knew there was something to lose. I spent the next few days making the necessary calls, getting in touch with a lawyer, setting things in motion to start separating our lives. The process was clinical, efficient, devoid of emotion. Ashley didn't fight me on anything, which only solidified the truth I had already come to accept. She wanted this to be over. She had been waiting for it. She had been waiting for me to be the one to pull the trigger so she wouldn't have to, so she could walk away without the guilt, without the responsibility of being the one to destroy our marriage. But she had destroyed it long before this. The only thing left to do was clean up the mess. I packed my things, not because she had any right to stay in the house, but because I couldn't bear to be there anymore. The walls felt suffocating, the memories laced with poison. Every inch of that place had been ours, our late-night conversations, our quiet Sunday mornings, our laughter, our fights, our shared history. But now it was just a graveyard, a place haunted by a love that had been killed long before I even realized it was dying. I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want any of it. So I took what was mine, signed the papers, and walked away. The strangest part of it all was the silence that followed. I had expected to feel relief, to feel lighter once I had finally cut ties with her, but the truth was there was no immediate gratification. The pain didn't disappear just because I had removed myself from the situation. It lingered, a dull ache that sat heavy in my chest, a constant reminder of what had been taken from me, of what I had lost. It wasn't just about Ashley, it was about everything I had believed in, everything I had built my life around, everything I had thought was unshakable. And now I had to figure out who I was without it. But there was also something else creeping in, something small but growing: resolve. Because as much as this hurt, as much as it had shattered me, I knew that I was going to come out the other side of it. Ashley had already moved on, already detached herself from the wreckage, but I wasn't her. I wasn't going to run from the pain, wasn't going to numb it with distractions or pretend it didn't exist. I was going to feel it, process it, let it shape me into something stronger. Because one thing was certain: I would never make this mistake again. I would never ignore the signs, never settle for someone who made me feel like an afterthought, never put my faith in someone who didn't deserve it. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of the person I had been before this. The man who had trusted too blindly, who had loved too deeply without making sure he was being loved the same way in return. That version of me had died the moment Ashley's secret had been spilled at that picnic, and now it was time to figure out who I was without her. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how long it would take to feel whole again, but I knew one thing with certainty: Ashley was my past. And I was never going to let her dictate my future. In the weeks that followed, I learned that moving on isn't a single moment of clarity, but a process of constant, slow adjustments. There wasn't a day where I suddenly woke up feeling lighter, where the weight of betrayal just disappeared, where the memories of my marriage stopped creeping up on me when I least expected it. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, a mix of anger, sadness, relief, and something unnameable that sat in the back of my mind like a dull ache. Some days I felt stronger than I had in years, like I had finally broken free from something that had been holding me back. Other days I found myself staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, wondering how it had all come to this, how I had spent so many years loving someone who had been so completely indifferent to me in the end. But as painful as it was, there was also something freeing about the destruction of my marriage. It forced me to rebuild, to re-examine who I was outside of the role of a husband, outside of the expectations I had placed on myself for so long. I had spent years bending, compromising, trying to be the kind of man Ashley wanted, trying to fit into a version of marriage that, as it turned out, had been nothing more than an illusion. But now there was nothing left to compromise for, nothing left to prove. I could just be without the weight of someone else's deception hanging over me. I didn't have to wonder if I was good enough, if I was doing enough, if I was the reason she had pulled away. Because I finally understood the truth: her betrayal had never been about me. It had been about her. About her selfishness, her entitlement, her inability to appreciate the love and stability she had been given. She had cheated because she wanted to, because she saw our marriage as something disposable, because she believed she would never get caught. And in the end, that was the biggest realization of all: she wasn't someone I had lost. She was someone I had been freed from. I started focusing on the things that had once brought me happiness but had been pushed aside for too long. I reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from in the years I had spent wrapped up in my marriage. I picked up hobbies I hadn't touched in forever, reminded myself that I was still me outside of the identity of being Ashley's husband. At first, it felt forced, like I was just going through the motions, like I was pretending to be okay when I wasn't. But then, little by little, it became real. I laughed without bitterness. I woke up without the immediate sting of remembering what had happened. I stopped checking her social media, stopped caring where she was or who she was with. I stopped feeling like her actions were a reflection of my worth. At some point, the divorce was finalized. There was no big dramatic ending, no final confrontation, no emotional goodbye. Just a stack of papers, a signature, a legal stamp confirming what I had already known for months: we were nothing to each other anymore. And as I walked out of the lawyer's office that day, I felt something settle in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes with closure, because I knew I would never get closure from her, but the kind that comes from finally letting go. She was no longer my concern, no longer my problem, no longer a weight I had to carry. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. And mine was to move forward. I won't lie and say I walked away completely unscathed. Betrayal leaves scars, no matter how strong you are. It changes the way you trust, the way you see people, the way you approach relationships. It makes you wary, makes you question things you never would have questioned before. But it also teaches you things you never wanted to learn, things that, in the end, make you stronger. I learned that love is only worth it if it's real, if it's reciprocated, if it's built on something solid. I learned that no amount of effort can fix something that another person has already decided to destroy. And most importantly, I learned that walking away isn't weakness, it's survival. If I could go back and talk to the version of myself who sat in that car after the picnic, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I would tell him this: you will be okay. It will hurt like hell. It will break you down in ways you never expected. But you will put yourself back together. And when you do, you will realize that the life you lost was never the one you were meant to have. Ashley will be nothing more than a name in my past, a lesson learned the hard way, a chapter that no longer defines me. And as for me, I'm still here, still standing, still moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I know I'm heading towards something better.